of you with great pleasure to our conversation with Shrayana Bhattacharya. Let me start with briefly introducing the group. So many of you already know, but just for those of you who are here for the first time, Women in Economics and Policy is a nonprofit that aims to create an inclusive space for women interested in economics and policy, where we try to learn from each other, network, and collaborate. The group currently consists of more than 1,500 women of various experiences, ages, and backgrounds with a common interest in economics, development, and policy issues. Please visit our website, www.womenineconandpolicy.com, or any of our social media pages. We're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, for more information and to stay updated on the group's activities. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to put down some housekeeping rules. We are recording this session. Please do check and make sure that your mics are on mute for the duration of the session. We have a few questions already planned for Shrayana, but if time permits, we will take on-the-spot questions towards the end of the session. So you can use the chat box feature to submit questions for the speaker during the session, and we'll be monitoring that. And if we have time towards the end, we will take those up towards the end of the session. All right, moving on to the speaker introduction. So I'm very, very excited to introduce our speaker for today. Shrayana Bhattacharya is trained in development economics at New Delhi University and Harvard University. Since 2014, in her role as an economist at a multilateral development bank, she's focused on issues related to social policy and jobs. Prior to this, she's worked on research projects with the Center for Policy Research, Seva Union, and Institute of Social Studies Trust. Her writing has appeared in the Indian Express, the Hindustan Times, EPW, Indian Quarterly, and the Caravan. In her path-breaking work, which we'll be discussing more today, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, Shrayana maps the economic and personal trajectories, the jobs, desires, prayers, love affairs, and rivalries of a diverse group of women. A most unusual and compelling book on the female gaze. This is the story of how women have experienced post-liberalization India. I'm sure a lot of us here who've read it have related to different parts of it and learned a lot from the rest. And we're so excited that Shrayana has agreed to talk to us today. Moderating the session, we have Sakshi, who's an aspiring development economist. She currently works at the World Bank in areas of social protection, agriculture, and social inclusion. She's also been a very active member of Women in Economics and Policy. She's on the organizing committee and currently working, been very generous with her time for the podcast team. So I will hand over to Sakshi and take it away, Sakshi.
Thanks, Anita. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much, Shrayana, again, for joining us today. I'd just like to start off with the first question, which is, where did the journey start? At what point did you realize that this could be something path-breaking? And yeah, we just want to know how these 15 years of research, what's the journey been like? What's the process been like?
Thanks so much, Sakshi, and just give me a thumbs up as long as you can hear me and, everything is set. Firstly, I just want to thank the whole group for inviting me. The journey of the book very much started as being a woman in economics and policy. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here. 15 years ago, I was in my early 20s, like so many of us. I just sort of, done a master's. And I had some rudimentary understanding of, survey methods, analyzing, capturing quantitative data and qualitative data. It's sort of specialized in methods. And if at that time, when I was in my early 20s, somebody would have said to me 15 years down the line, you would have a book where apparently it would bring together women's role in the economy with your favorite actor, that I just roll my eyes and say, get out of here. I mean, that's not possible. So honestly, I think the one thing I do want to start by just saying is that the journey has been surprising. And I think the person who's most surprised, to paraphrase one of my favorite authors, is me. I'm the most surprised at the way things have turned out. Where the book started, Sakshi, was in 2006. I was a research assistant working for a feminist think tank called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. I was working for Ratna Sudarshan. She was the head of the institute at that time, a fabulous economist. And she essentially, for a project we were doing with Seva, which I think, as many of us know, is one of the world's largest labor unions of women working in the informal sector. I was sent to do survey work as well as some qualitative work on women making agarbattis, incense sticks at home. They were typically earning about a quarter of minimum wage. And when I showed up, very excited, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, to ask my questions and do this research, and I'd reach the field, as we call it, I realized that actually I was talking to women who were actively aware of their own economic rights. They were unionizing, they were fighting with their families, they were fighting with their employers. They were extremely well aware of their economic circumstances. They really did not need some young, foolish person like myself to come and ask them these questions. They knew. So they indulged me, of course, which I think they do to most researchers, honestly, coming in from the outside. But I don't know, I really picked up on that atmosphere of just boredom around my questions. And I thought, well, what's the one way we can dispel boredom and at least infuse some life into these conversations? And, we started talking about the few things that we had in common. And in our country, we're also deeply divided by language, class, customs, so many things. But popular Hindi cinema still does have its pull, certainly where I was. And I just started asking them about their favorite actor. And everywhere I went, actually starting from, Ahmedabad, where I was doing work on agarbatti workers and garment workers, to rural UP, to Jharkhand, and beyond. Everywhere I went, not everyone was a Shah Rukh fan, but many women were Shah Rukh fans. And I knew there was something very special and electric about the way suddenly the tone of the conversation just immediately changed. Suddenly all these women were really keen to talk to me, where earlier they found my questions really boring. Suddenly we were in an atmosphere where they started talking to me about their economic circumstances much more openly. I think because that link between them liking an actor and then them having the purchasing power to actually be able to watch this actor on their own terms, them being able to access public space to watch this actor, them being able to access media markets, all of that suddenly just came to the fore in that sort of period between 2006 till around 2007-8. And I decided, I think, very early on, not honestly from the perspective of a book, but just for my own self, that I wanted to just, keep in touch. And some of us did just keep in touch. So every time Mr. Khan would have a release, we'd chat, we'd talk about the film. Invariably, and it'll happen right now, if we start talking about a film we like, we'll immediately start talking about where we were in our lives when we watched it. There are associations, right, that we make. It's never the actual film that is being discussed. And that continued. And sometime in 2013-14, I initially had thought that I would write a book just on the women I met in rural Uttar Pradesh, because I thought there was something very interesting going on about them using the small, meager amounts of money that they were making to essentially create a fan club. They were organizing screenings of his films. And, it seemed really banal on the surface, but I knew there was something very powerful going on. And I think just because of somewhere I was in my personal life, I decided in around 2013 that I would no longer just keep it exclusively focused on UP. I would broaden it out to actually tell the stories of many of the women I'd known for a very long period of time. I also at that time started actively soliciting interviews for women who are from my own class background, which was, I think, the only sort of non-accidental, more formal part of the research that I did, other than the longitudinal interviews. And I wrote a draft, which is a really bad draft, till around 2017-18. I delivered the draft to the woman who is my agent, but I very much call her my PhD guide, Shruti Devi, in 2019. She's like book Yoda, and she gave some really formative inputs into the book. And from there, of course, the pandemic struck. So we edited and we submitted in 2020. And it was edited finally by Shaugat Dasgupta at HarperCollins India, who actually had edited an earlier piece of mine when I had sort of decided to change my voice from being much more academic and formal to being much more personal. He was really instrumental in that. So it was great that he came back to edit the final book. And we edited, in fact, through the brutal second wave of the pandemic, which was quite awful and very, I think, trying for everyone. And yeah, somehow now when I tell you this, it sounds really linear, but when we were living through it and feeling through it, I guess this is true for anyone who puts anything together, right? Any kind of writing or art or anything, it just does not feel linear when you're in that time. And magically then by 2021, we had a draft, it was done. But it has been a very long process because it involved not only recognizing that the conversations that I thought I was having just on the fly were actually material which could be converted into a book. It required then going back to many of the people, and some did not want to participate, some did, making tough choices about how to just organize that. It involved then interviewing other economists and people, particularly from the film industry, because I don't know anything about film. And it also it was a long process, but it was also a very enjoyable process, because the one thing that really kept me going, to be honest, Sakshi, and I'll close with this, is that, almost every year between 2006 till 2020, I felt like, I'd read reports on what was happening to women in the economy and women in society. And I'd see a lot of nonfiction books being produced in India. And, all of that was just extremely enriching, useful information. But it also encouraged me because I really felt there was this strange disconnect in my mind between the stories I knew I had access to and I was privy to, even my own life, and the stories that I was consuming of sort of what is happening to women in the country. Because I think often we are told stories about heroes, or we're told stories about victims. So like the big business women, or we're told about people who really suffered, abusively, physically so, right? And they show up in crime reports. But I realized the women I was talking to are this sort of missing middle, right? To borrow that phrase from economics, of the narrative. And I felt very encouraged that while maybe the stories on the surface don't seem particularly radical or indicative of big sweeping social change, my hope really was, and I was encouraged and motivated by the fact that because I had followed these women in time, longitudinally, I was able to capture sort of the really rough texture of what social change can feel like, looking at it from the prism of gender. And I was very motivated to tell that story. So it's been long, but it's been energetic.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And, you mentioned that a draft of the book was ready pre-pandemic. And when you worked on the book through these 2 years of the pandemic, what changed in your perspective and in your, additional research and writing? Was there a shift, and how was that process?
Well, a couple of things happened. I think all of us lost people who were very close to us, right? I also faced that. And I'm quite certain, people tell me now when they read, particularly, I think the preface of the book, like what sets it up and parts of the end, people feel like, I've had people tell me that there are tears, and I think it has a certain emotional charge, which I think I didn't realize, honestly, when I was writing it. I'm quite convinced, actually, now when I look back, I think it had that because we were all of us, right? I mean, it was a cumulative sense of just despair, I think, particularly, where all of us were living. And so I have a feeling, I don't know, I think subconsciously that kind of despair and uncertainty has found its way, but a more hopeful side to it, because I really needed to see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's just my personality type, perhaps. And also my privilege, because I think, people with luxuries can look at sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. You can look long run and things like that. And so I really felt that I'm sure that that's found its way into the text. So that's one, right? The other, I think, thing that happened to me, funnily, was that, that period of the pandemic, just professionally for me, was very busy, because I was part of the bank's team that was leading some of the development policy operations that the bank was supporting for COVID responses. And what that actually did, funnily, was made me very good about time management, because I only had certain amounts of time. It was like, they always say, right, like women who are working with kids are often, there's like this stereotype that they're good at managing time because you have to, you're sort of forced to do it, right? You have to sort of partition time out. I really felt like that period just threw me into that. So instead of being lazy and lackadaisical and somewhat relaxed, I had to be really rigorous with my time. So I think for good or for bad, that really helped. And the third thing I think that it really helped me was, I think I felt that the pandemic seemed to have almost amplified the sort of idea that, the women I followed, at least, there was a deep loneliness that they were experiencing at home in their personal lives. Even if they were in loving relationships and loving families, there was a kind of, drudgery of being a woman, particularly like the married women who came from certain fairly privileged circumstances. And I think, in fact, that entire section, the first section of the book, which is much more about elite upper class women, that became much more, I think it crystallized even further for me through the pandemic, because they were all complaining about how, even though they were working from home, all the burden of care, and we know this, right? There's data that shows this, that while there were some minor shifts in men helping a little bit more at home because they were also at home, the broad burden fell on women. And the women I was following were just so exhausted. They were watching Shah Rukh films at that time. I write about it. And so I think that story became a lot more fleshed out, particularly amongst the elite section of the book. And then there were some things that happened in the pandemic, which I won't give away for those who haven't read it, which then just found its way into the text. Because there were things that were happening with some of the women actually called me to say that, do you know, this is what happened to me? And I think they were keen for that story to be told, about being abandoned in cities when there was an unprepared for lockdown, and what was happening with the welfare schemes and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, so I think it benefited strangely from just the fact that the pandemic seemed to have amplified all our pre-existing inequalities irrespective, right? So that finds its way into the book. And I think I was just a bit more rigorous about my time in the book. And I think it has a certain emotional charge. My sense is the writing, because I think I was occupying a certain moment, I think, which all of us were.
Thank you for sharing that with us. You touched on this very important point about domestic drudgery, and that was so apparent during the pandemic, because there were all these statistics about how across the world men in India rank among the lowest when it comes to sharing the household burden. And yeah, that was and then when people were sharing these on social media, like, men doing the dishes, and they were applauding these men, I found it very amusing.
Yeah, no, I mean, we are in the bottom five. I often say, I think I don't know why we keep expecting women to sort of bear the burden of social change when it comes to gender. I think a lot of the work now needs to be done by men, and let's start with the kitchen. I am a big believer in that. I've been on, like, some people invited me to Valentine's Day shows, and they asked me, what's the most romantic thing anyone can do? I'm like, well, if you're a straight man, do the dishes. I mean, just look at them and enjoy doing them, do them happily, like the way Shah Rukh does in his movies, and I think that was very important. So I hear you. But I think we have a long way to go, because it's still very much, exactly as you said, it's still seen as a very exotic thing that a man will do, right? Like a gimmick, like I'm doing you a favor, or I'm doing this, to advertise how genuine and generous I am. It should ideally just be natural. And my faith is in long run negotiations that can perhaps still that burden of labor.
That's true. It's a fight worth fighting, but it's a long and slow and tiring process. One of the most endearing things about the book was that there was a personal element in it. And I thought the step you took to include your personal journey, where you talked so honestly and so self-reflectively about your own experiences, I found that very endearing, and that connected me to the book even more. So what inspired you to take that step, and what inspired you to include that aspect into the book?
Sakshi, I read a lot of nonfiction, just Indian nonfiction abroad. And actually, this kind of writing is very common in the West, be it like France, Germany, the US, certainly, UK. I mean, a lot of there are books about, women navigating mating markets, women navigating media, women in sort of, Nigerian film as well. There are people who've often written entering and situating themselves very clearly as where they are in the sort of socioeconomic pyramid that they are, in the context in which they're writing about, right? And I realized a lot of the writing that I tended to really respond to very well, I really enjoyed reading, often was usually, can I ask someone to mute? I feel like someone hasn't muted. Yeah, it's fine. It's done. Yeah, and so I always responded very well to that kind of writing. And I also noticed, I realized just the nature of this research was such that it felt so dishonest to write a story about other women struggling in love and labor and the labor of love, right? Like their economic lives and their personal lives, without then being also just upfront about where I was in that. Because if I was going to tell a story about contemporary womanhood in India and how the economy was shaping it in particular, I could not be, I mean, I think it would just be disingenuous and really dishonest to then just take this like very socially distant gaze, right? That I'm looking at you, but I'm not part of this. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I brought in the choice to sort of anchor this around Mr. Khan was made, because I felt that that was actually something that helped flatten out, you know, it was this one thing that allowed us to actually talk about intimacy, economic independence together, irrespective of where we were, me or anyone. And so I think it was a, to be honest, it wasn't even a choice I made. I just couldn't imagine writing this book any other way. And I think even if I write anything in the future, I can't imagine approaching it without just being very upfront. But having said that, I think the challenge with that, Sakshi, honestly, is that the book is not about me. The book is about these other women whose stories I have followed and I try to tell, and women at large and the economy in particular. And I wanted to set the right balance, because I wanted, obviously, the reader to know me and where I was in my relationships with these women, just the way the women who I followed knew me a bit, you know, because otherwise, why are they opening up about all of this? It's because there was this kind of energy between us and there were experiences we shared. I wanted to invite the reader into that as well. But at the same time, I did not want to sort of become, you know, this narcissistic sort of vulnerability porn, right? Of like, oh, this is about me and let me tell you, because, and I think there I'm really grateful. I had really good editors and guides, because I think they made sure that I wasn't self-conscious about the way I was entering into the text, but then I also struck the right balance, because the story is about other people, not me. But I did want the reader to recognize that I also occupy the socioeconomic matrix of the economy of India. And to, I think, to essentially erase myself from that would be just too dishonest. I would not be able to do it. And I also think, remember, I was seeking permission, right, to write about these women. And I really felt that it would just be so, I couldn't imagine going to them and saying, well, I want to write about you, but, you know, I'm not there, because they knew things that were going on in my life as well. And so I think without sort of giving into that sort of excessive vulnerability, which is sometimes I think is just often performative as well, I wanted to just strike the right balance, but not disappear from the text and not other the people that I was writing about, because we are in this together. I really wanted the reader to know that loneliness, I mean, yes, it's compounded by caste and class, but that feeling, that tinge of it is very similar. Feeling lonely in your relationships, feeling lonely in the economy. And that's why I think I was present. And so, to be honest, it wasn't a conscious choice. I just couldn't imagine writing it any other way.
That actually brings me to my next question. Were there any reactions to the book that surprised you, from different, any reaction that you'd not expect, from this particular segment of the population or from this particular person?
For some reason, everyone seems to think I'm a Shah Rukh Khan expert, and I'm not. I mean, I'm too ordinary a fan. The number of times people in the media will ask me, so do you think, what impact do you think? And they seem to couch the book as the impact that Mr. Khan has had on women. I am sure he's had an impact on the women. I think it's there for the reader to tease out. But being an economist, and I know what that word impact is loaded with, it makes me very uncomfortable when I hear that, because I think it's a co-creation, right? It's like these women were also ready to absorb a certain kind of influence, and then he's had an impact. It's sort of co-created as opposed to him having an impact on this. You know, I think you understand. I think econometrically as well, you would understand what I'm trying to say. So I find it really funny that people, you know, come like I as if this is part of what, you know, you would call Shah Rukh studies, because then the problem is he is so iconically iconic, right? Like, I mean, to borrow someone who's, I recently was reading something someone was writing about Greta Garbo, and they called her this. And I think he's the same. And the problem is, the moment you write about him in any way, he was my research method in the book. As you know, the book is not about him. I think what has surprised me is how much I think people enter into the text or talk to me about the book being about him, although in the second page itself, it says the book is not about him, it's about how people use his icon. And so then, of course, I talk about his icon because I can't not, right? Because if they're using that text and those metaphors and languages, I have to explain that to the reader. But what has surprised me is that people seem to think I have expertise, and I don't, because all the intelligent things I have to say about his icon honestly come from reading, talking to other people, a bunch of interviews. I think my expertise is in the area of social science, trying to mix methods and trying to tell a story. And that's been surprising. And then the other thing that has, I mean, shouldn't surprise me, but I think it is salient, is I noticed the response to the book is very gendered right now. I noticed in the initial phase, I think before I had a podcast with Amit Verma, and I think prior to that, I sort of noticed that mostly everyone who immediately took to the book were often people from queer communities or straight women. Like that was something I noticed. Whereas like straight men, I in fact got messages from a lot of women readers saying, well, I wanted my boyfriend or my husband to read it, and he sort of shirked at it. I think that's changing slowly and steadily as the book's life sort of evolves, but that doesn't surprise me. But I do think it's salient that, why is it that a book on womanhood should only be read by women? In fact, I really hope that the book is read more and more by men. So yeah.
No, that is something even I hope for, because I think this book should be read by anyone who wants to understand, know more about the lives of women in India, because it's so interconnected with, your social norms, your patriarchy. It's not like, yes, like they're living lonely lives, but it's because of like the structures in society and the expectations that society has created. So thank you for that answer. Um, I also, there's so many lines in the book that have stayed with me. But one of the things that you write is that there's a shift in there's a generational shift in expectations of women. Young women no longer want to marry a Shah Rukh Khan, but they want to be a Shah Rukh Khan. But at the same time, you see at the macro level women dropping out of the labor force. And that's very, very obvious, especially like during these last few years. And you also see like these rigid barriers to women exercising their autonomy and agency. So how do you, as a researcher, as an economist, as a reader, sort of reconcile these contrasting observations, and what gives you hope for for future progress?
Thanks, Sakshi. You know what gives me hope, and I sort of get into this in, I think it's like the third last chapter, or maybe the second last chapter of the book. It's called An Equilibrium of Silly Expectations. I think a lot of social change, I mean, the story that I'm trying to tell in the book, as messy as all these different lives are and as different as they are, the one thing that is actually common amongst all of them is that somehow I think a combination of being the first generation of women, perhaps to have access to media, to formal schooling at a primary level, the first generation of women to notice that men are enjoying far more freedoms because of economic growth. Suddenly there are highways and malls and opportunities that they see brothers can have and fathers can have, but they can't. All of that has created in a lot of these women a very strong and enhanced sense of expectations from the market, expectations from families. They expect more from husbands, they expect more from men. This is true, in fact, for all the women in the book. They are, we can dismiss them as saying, and one of the expectations is that the men should be like Shah Rukh, right? And what does that mean? That actually means, through the book, you'll see that actually means that a more kinder, accommodating masculinity, which is much more supportive of women's choices. That is actually rather simply what is going on. And, we can dismiss them. I know it's sort of serious, high-minded people may dismiss them as being silly expectations, which is why I call it that in the book. But I really do think that what's happening is these women now no longer, and now you're right, it's intergenerational. You see it in the book, that no longer is it that they just want to marry a man who has an accommodative masculinity. They want to actually have all the social and economic trappings of that masculinity brings as well. They want to move to cities, they want jobs like Shah Rukh, they want to be him. And I think what we're seeing is, while the outcomes on the ground may be very frustrating and will take time, I think the first step to sort of challenge norms is to imagine in your own psychological interior, your own mind, that there is an alternative way in which male-female relationships and familial relationships can look. And that will then stir in you this change in expectations. And once you start to voice those expectations in very gradual steps, and you see this through all the stories, then you start to crack away at, sort of very rigid norms, which happens in the book. But the first step has to be almost like utopia, which is why I say that all those scenes, in Switzerland with the chiffon saris and this like soppy man with his arms wide open, it's totally ridiculous to most people. But I really wanted the reader to walk away realizing, and there's a quote from one of my favorite anthropologists, the French anthropologist, who says that it's utopia where we start to really question our notions of family, government, consumption, religion. You have to imagine it. And I think, funnily, those films, those like soppy films, are creating this like utopian circumstance from which then many of these women are starting to critique their real lives. And then their expectations of real life, be it markets, jobs, men, are increasing. So to me, I think I see the contrast that you're drawing, but I think the reconciliation lies in the expectations. That I do think we are a generation of women, and I think this is much more true for even the next generation of women, girls right now, for example, who are fighting to like just be sent back to school because of ridiculous norms about what they can wear. The fact that they're so out and vociferous and vocal is because they expect more from the state. They expect equality from the state. They expect to be treated better from families, from markets, from schooling institutions. And unlike, I think, the generation before, which would be somewhat, you'd adjust or you'd settle or, you try and navigate it in one way or the other. I think the stories in the book tell us that intergenerationally, that willingness to just settle and accept things as they are, that appetite has really dramatically reduced. And I think that's the story. Now, will that story lead to more women being economically independent and standing on their own two feet? We will see. I think that will require very serious policy parameters and different kinds of changes. It will require a masculinity that is also reforming itself, which I have no expectations of, to be very honest, at this stage. And so we're in this for a long fight. I end the book by saying this, that I don't have rose-tinted glasses on where we stand when it comes to gender in our country. I think we're in it for a very long fight. Our politics is also signaling this. And but I think the first step has to be that women have to expect more. And I do think generationally women are expecting more. You can't capture it in data, but it's there. And it's for any one of us to see, just stepping outside your house or just going on the internet.
That is true. You have to start at your personal level first. And I do see, even like I observe that when the younger generation voices these expectations, at first the older generation is kind of taken aback. You're like, hey, I mean, that's unreasonable to expect. But if you persist and continue that fight, somewhere along the line, like, there is a shift even in like older generations' perception.
I completely agree. And one thing I did want the reader to sort of walk away. Often there's this conversation on social change, which tends to happen on the internet amongst sort of, I think, the elite, where there's this idea that like social change is like a dress, like if I want to change my mind, I'll buy a dress. And it's like as if it's, social change is not a marketing campaign. It's not like I have to get you to buy a product. It is a fundamental change in your psychological makeup inside yourself, and not just the things you say outside. It's in your private behavior. And to me, the stories in the book are trying to give you a sense that actually there can be social change without too much dhamaka on the surface. This, like what you were saying, right? This everyday negotiations, everyday voicing your expectations, everyday taxing people. And I think that, to me, what was interesting was that all these women arrive at some kind of change in their immediate personal lives. It'll never be like, on a hashtag, or it won't be a big movement. But I think there is a silent movement. There's a strong social movement. All of us together here are part of it, of women who just want to be much more acceptable and loved for being outside the home. It's a simple thing to say, but it's very hard to do. And I hope that people walking away from the book realize that actually social change has a very quiet side to it, which may not be very visible or apparent, but is very important as we move forward.
Absolutely. I now want to move the conversation more towards the field of development, economics, and policy, your book reveals a very human side of economics, about how behind every data point there is a story and there is a context. In your understanding, in your the past 15 years of being in this field, what do you think has changed or evolved in the way research is conducted, in sort of the approach, the motivation and guiding principles of like development research as a field? And where do you see it going? What are some of the things that have changed that are maybe not for the best, or maybe take away from research the human aspect of research, make it maybe transactional? Or what do you think? What is your take on that?
I'll say two things. I have a lot to say, and I think I'm still thinking about this a lot, actually. Anyway, and maybe for something I do in the future. But I have two things to say, I think. One, I think, for the good, and one for the bad. I think what's really great is I notice in economics in particular, there's such a great appetite to engage in, what we would call grounded economics, right? Field up, be it RCTs, be it design of survey methods, how do you capture data, different methods of modeling. I mean, there's a lot more interest in trying to think very carefully and hard about people's voices. Unsurprisingly, I think a lot of that work is being done by some fabulous women in the field, but still, but I do think that that's a big shift. I sense that, and I'm quite hopeful about it. Like, for example, behavioral economics has now just exploded as a field, right? And thinking about psychology and emotions and all these things in the way we think about the impacts of programs or the impacts of policies. I think that's really, to me, that's really interesting. I think there's a greater appetite for interdisciplinary work. And my hope is that will grow, and we'll see. That's one. What I think is bad is there's this like big premium on, what I think many of us call solutionism, right? So stick like biometrics and then something amazing will happen, right? Like there's a lot of premium, I think, particularly with the way donor agencies are financing academic work. I think the way academia is also funded, the prestige that's given to like academics. I just, there's a very strong focus on sort of, everyone says it's not a magic bullet, but actually everyone is kind of selling a magic bullet. You notice it in the way a lot of these papers are written, right? And I'm very skeptical of that. In fact, the papers themselves show us that we should be skeptical, because long run impacts of sort of these interventions are very different.
Sorry about that. I think, Shrayana, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I think, lost your audio.
No, I think that's because I'm back. Yeah. No, so I think this easy solutionism, I'm very skeptical of, because, as we know, anything like, for example, think about women's collectives, right? Like when you do data collection on the impacts of women's collectives, it's really hard to sort of show that. It takes a long period of time. There are researchers who really tried with mixed methods to show the sort of, multiplier effects of women's collectives. But, to get into trying to assess the impact or the implications of women's collectives and solidarity movements using solutions, right? Is a women's collective a solution? I think then you're doing this. It's really not just to social phenomena. It's not just to humans. It's not just to people. It's not just to the complexity of people. So yeah, I think solutionism is where I'm a bit worried. And I think multidisciplinary work, thinking much more carefully about emotions and psychology, certainly in economic behavior, is where I'm very excited about the field. Yeah.
Another question I want to ask you, as a researcher, as an economist, when through your interactions and conversations with women from so many different castes, religions, and regions in India, how did your priors about women in the Indian economy, in the Indian market and in society update? As Alice Evans says, like rocking your priors. How was that for you?
I say this in the book. I think the role of love as a lever of women's economic behavior That really did surprise me. I mean, I knew, there's the literature you read and the stuff you know about care labor and about domestic work. That is different, but there is a labor of love. I mean, the way that love is a tax, love is an incentive, love is also an outcome. I think love mediating women's experiences across classes. And we tend to think in our sort of very privileged circles that love is an indulgence. It's like a luxury good that you can focus on after you have all your basic other needs met, right? There's this kind of idea. I realize that's absolute rubbish. I mean, everyone wants to feel loved. Everyone wants to be loved a certain way. Everybody needs support from their loved ones, irrespective of where they are. And I think that really surprised me. I think the other thing that really surprised me was I was quite shocked at the sense of rivalry I noticed, actually, particularly women in low income and sort of emerging middle class settings, rivalry with men in their own families often. The fact that, the kind of, you can see the privileges and the freedoms that men have, and these women were actively articulating them as sort of, as almost jealous comparisons. I did not see. I didn't realize that was so apparent it surprised me the depth of that, to be perfectly honest, and how it was felt. So I think those two things.
Sorry, I'll again request everyone to please mute their mics. But yeah, that's a very interesting answer. And yeah, it's not something that as an economist or as a researcher you think about that tangent, but that's very interesting to know. My next question brings me to our last 2 years that we've all lived. We've seen, and we've discussed this so far, in the conversation we've had, that the pandemic has sort of reversed some of the progress in gender equality, particularly in India. To what extent are these problems being addressed by the policy responses to COVID? And from a policy perspective, where do you see us right now?
I'm trying to not sound depressing in my answer. So it's going to take me a minute. Look, I think the one thing we do now know is in the first 3 weeks of the first wave of the pandemic, India did release 320 million payments to women's bank accounts, right? And it was an implementation pipeline that was fairly robust. There might be people who needed to receive the money. They were not on the databases of the programs to receive the money. So inclusion may be an issue, including people in a dynamic way. So I think the pipelines exist. I think the current focus on, we also know Narega, for instance, it is a women-friendly program. I mean, the more you have demand, often it is women who do actually account for a significant share of works that are being created, right? And that's also a very important form of just work and supplemental income in households. Now, given all of that, I think what I would like to see is a much more concerted focus on, income transfers, opening up welfare transfers, could be targeted to women, ideally so, or even just general influx of these kinds of transfers to certain sets of households. We're not seeing that sort of large scale inclusion. And I think that's very important for two reasons. One, to sort of release some of women's creative energies outside the home, and also to then encourage other forms of risk-taking, productivity enhancing behaviors, because these transfers do provide they're not just risk assurance, but they're also psychological assurance. And I think those two tools are very important. We're not seeing that yet. I often say, I think when it comes to gender, we're living in a bit of an equilibrium of platitudes and lip service. I think we say a lot, but if you look at the sort of concrete, so last year, the gender budget showed us only around 0.69% of the GDP was spent on women-oriented programs and interventions. This is the union budget. And, if we were really taking women's work seriously, we would think very carefully about rewarding and acknowledging unpaid domestic work. We would think very carefully about domestic drudgery. We would think very carefully about easing or subsidizing the pipeline for work, right, between women who are studying and access to job opportunities, be it migration, constraints to housing, so on and so forth. We would think about it in a much more mission mode focused way. Just as an example, I'm working on a project in West Bengal where actually one of the things we're doing with the state is the goal is to actually improve women's labor market outcomes. And instead of doing it in silos, you actually have an integrated platform, which will bring in different interventions from the private sector, ministries, and so on. But in a way, the government will hold itself accountable, let's hope so, in the future, to whether women's employment outcomes improved or not. Now, they may not improve dramatically. And again, there's going to be no linear correlation there. But I think it's important to start to think of it as a clear policy priority. I hear a lot of lip service. I don't see enough credible action. And so while I'm very, I think what is very positive is the fact that these welfare transfers, when they're targeted to women, they are reaching them. Women are using Narega. This works, right? It's a channel that can be used, be it the PDS, be it cash transfers, be it Manrega. I would like to see much more amplified focus on those. And I'm waiting.
Thank you for that answer. I was also wondering what drew you to the field of social protection and, to working at World Bank.
It's funny. I have always been, for the past 15 years of my life, I've only worked on welfare programs. And it's the only thing that I was interested in, because right from the time I was at ISST, I was working at that time much more from the workers' side, because it was looking at whether workers were accessing programs. I switched from there. I was working with the Delhi Secretariat briefly, where I was looking at urban social protection programs that the government was trying to scale up, particularly looking through something called Mission Convergence in Slums. I think I've always been very committed to that, probably because my mother, as a young, this is a very formative experience. My mom, when I was very young, she was a social worker. Her job was actually to help refugees settle into India and to provide them, the sort of welfare package that the UN entitled registered refugees to have access to. And it was really stressful because obviously as a social worker, you don't really have power to decide. There are rules that decide. There's no discretion. And yet she felt that there was so much more that could be done. And I could hear her grumbling and being quite upset. And I think as a kid, I realized at a very young age that these transfers are actually quite formative. They're transformational. They're really formative, not just in terms of just making sure people don't fall into chronic poverty, but that psychological assurance, right? That you will not, that there is a layer of protection. You have a safety net. And I think that from a very young age, I was very committed to that. And it's a commitment that I've really sort of, has grown, I think, through chance and through also my own pursuits as I move forward. And it will be an area I will continue to work on. I think it is what I will do for a long period of time.
That's really nice to hear and very inspiring. Unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our conversation. We're almost, we're out of time. But before closing, we usually ask our guests this question: what are you reading right now?
I'm reading 2 books. I'm reading a review copy of a fabulous book by an author called Madhumita Datta. The book's called Mobile Girls Kuttam. It's actually about garment workers in Tamil Nadu. It's a book that's coming out with Zuban, and it's fabulous. And the other book I'm reading, more I think for instruction on what I write next, is I'm reading Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, which is actually a letter he wrote when he was in prison to his lover, the lover who scorned him. So yeah, that's what I'm reading right now, and I'm loving those. And I recommend these, and definitely Madhumita Datta's book is an excellent book.
Great. Thank you for sharing those recommendations also. So, this has been an incredible session. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We're going to wrap up this part of the session now. We're so sorry we can't take any more questions from the chat. But thank you so much for writing this book, for talking to us today. Through this book, you've brought together so many, often unsaid, unacknowledged, and even like dismissed aspects of women's lives in India. And like you said, the journey to gender equality is slow, tiring, frustrating. But even the little wins that we see in our own lives and lives of our mothers, our friends, our peers, give us hope. And that we hope that this conversation continues. Luckily, right now, the conversation is going to continue. So we're going to move to a book discussion organized in collaboration with Feminist Economics and Policy Initiative. And